This German Shepherd mixed dog looked into a storm drain every day, and when it was finally open, people were shocked to see what was inside. In many countries, stray dogs are a common occurrence, but one dog in particular fascinated people by his actions. In a bustling city in Greece, a scruffy German Shepherd mixed dog named Max was wandering down the street. It was a daily routine for him to scavenge for any food or water he could find. The day had started like normal, with Max happily trotting down the road, wagging his tail at anyone who looked his way. Despite living on the streets, Max was very friendly and loved to get pets from people passing by. As he made his way down one particular street, he suddenly smelled something delicious. He followed his nose until he found himself standing in front of a bakery. Looking through the window, Max watched customers buy fresh loaves of bread and pastries. Just looking at the food made Max realize how hungry he was, and his stomach let out a loud growl. Inside the shop, a young man named Alex was finishing paying for a bag of pastries. Once he was done, he thanked the baker and made his way out of the shop. Outside, Alex started walking down the street toward his apartment when, all of a sudden, he heard a loud gurgle and a whimper. The confused young man turned around only to see Max looking back at him with very sad eyes. Once again, the dog's stomach growled, and Alex knew then what the problem was. Max was clearly a stray and a very hungry one at that. Seeing the hungry animal, Alex immediately felt bad for him. He looked down at the pastries he had just bought before marching back into the bakery and asking for any leftover bread or scraps that the baker wouldn't sell. The baker happily gave Alex what he wanted. Alex exited the shop and looked around for Max. He soon found him watching from a distance. The young man crouched down on the floor and carefully held out a piece of bread. At first, Max was cautious and didn't want to get too close, but the longer Alex held the food out to him, the less the dog could resist. Creeping closer to get the meal, finally, Alex managed to gain enough of Max's trust that he started wagging his tail and accepted the bread. But instead of eating the food right then and there, Max picked it up and began walking off as if he had somewhere to be. Confused about the dog's reaction but not wanting to question it too much, Alex simply stood back up and made his way back home. The next day, Alex was walking down the street when he noticed Max again. The dog seemed to have noticed him as well and came happily bounding up to him with his tail wagging. Alex smiled at Max's enthusiasm and began to fuss over him. Unfortunately, the young man had places to be, so he couldn't spend too much time with the dog. Before he left, though, he made sure to buy Max a meat pie from a nearby shop. But once again, Max didn't eat it straight away and instead walked off again. Alex was curious about the dog's behavior. However, he didn't have time to follow him and had to go about his day instead. On the third day, Alex once again found Max. Only this time, it looked like he was waiting for him. The young man had started carrying treats in his bag in the hope that he would be able to give them to the stray. Alex smiled as he approached Max and gave him the treats he had. This time, when Max turned around and walked away though, Alex began to follow him. They eventually came to a busy street, and Alex watched as Max made his way over to a storm drain. The dog sat down next to the drain and looked down into it. He then dropped one of the treats Alex had just given him into it before eating his own. The young man was very confused. Just what was Max doing? For the next few days, Alex would find Max sitting and staring into the storm drain. Every time he brought the dog some treats, Max would always drop half of the food into the drain before eating his own share. Eventually, Alex became so curious that he decided to go and take a look for himself as to what was so interesting in the drain. But he never expected what he found. Alex crept over to the storm drain, wary of Max, who was standing guard next to it, but the dog simply watched the young man curiously. Once Alex was directly above the drain, he looked down into it and gasped at what he saw. Immediately, he reached for his phone and called the fire department. He would need their help. Roughly half an hour later, a couple of firemen showed up and asked Alex what was wrong. He explained to them what he had seen, and the men quickly got to work. They walked over to the storm drain, but at that moment, Max began to growl at them. Not wanting to be bitten, the firemen stopped. They didn't know what to do, but luckily Alex did. He carefully walked up to Max, reassuring the dog that the men were only there to help. He then held a treat out to him, and when Max finally approached to take it, Alex grabbed hold of him to keep him away from the drain and the firemen. With Max out of the way, the firemen opened the storm drain. By this point, because the drain was in the middle of a busy street, a crowd had formed around the firemen to see what they were doing. After a few tense minutes, the firemen finally revealed what Max had been so focused on. Inside the drain was a tiny puppy in one of the firemen's arms. All of the bystanders were shocked, but that wasn't the end of it. The fireman ducked back into the storm drain 4 more times, and each time he came up, another puppy was in his arms. Alex was astounded at what he was witnessing. He knew that something was down there, as he had seen it when he peeked in, but he had no idea that 5 tiny and adorable puppies had been trapped. At that moment, Max managed to wriggle his way out of Alex's arms and bounded over to the fireman who had the puppies. As soon as Max saw the small dogs, he immediately began to wag his tail and sniff at them. The puppies yipped back at him. Alex walked over to the firemen and asked them just how such young puppies ended up in such a predicament. The firemen told him that it was likely they were swept into the drain during heavy rain, but considering that they had been trapped, they weren't starving. At this piece of information, Alex looked over at Max. He knew that it was thanks to him sharing his food every day that the puppies had survived. Seeing such a kind act of selflessness, Alex knew what he wanted to do next. He told the firemen that he would take the puppies home with him to raise them until they were ready to be rehomed. The fireman agreed and gave the puppies to Alex. The young man then began to make his way back home before turning around and calling out to Max, "Come on, buddy, it's time to go home." Max happily bounded up to him. Alex looked after all of the puppies and found 4 of them loving homes when they were old enough to move. He kept one for himself, as he had grown to love them dearly. As well as that, Max finally had a home to call his own, as Alex had fallen in love with the scruffy dog and couldn't bear to leave him on the streets after what he had done for the tiny puppies. The family lived happily together, with neither Charlie the puppy nor Max the slightest bit worried that they would end up on the streets again. Alex loved them too much, and they loved him just as much back.